In her new book, NPR Political Correspondent, Sarah McCammon takes a closer look at a growing movement away from the white evangelical church. Her perspective is part investigative and entirely personal. I spoke with her recently about the book, The EXvangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church.
My guest today is Sarah McCammon. McCammon is NPR's national political correspondent and co-host of the NPR Politics Podcast. Her reporting dives into the heated worlds of national politics, religion, and presidential campaigns. McCammon's work always exposes the deep divide these issues create in America, and it challenges us to confront the complex conflict shaping the nation's social, political, religious, and cultural landscape. In her New York Times bestseller, The EXvangelicals, McCammon explores the growing exodus that is happening in white evangelical Christianity. This book is part memoir, and it delves into McCammon's own experiences with evangelicalism and its dogmatic influence on her life. Through interviews with other ex-evangelicals, McCammon examines the emotional and spiritual struggles they've faced as they left evangelicalism, highlighting their journey of grappling with fear, shame, and the loss of community that once shaped their identity and beliefs. Sarah, having personal self-agency, I think all the experts would say that is when a person is at their most centered. It's when they are the healthiest. When they have a self-agency, it's always tethered to their self-identity. Again, this is what the experts would say. This is what makes up a healthy human life. So my question is, do the doctrines of evangelicalism, submission to the authority of God, submission to the authority of the Bible, submission to maybe the authority of a church community or a minister, do you think those things add to somebody's self-agency, or do they threaten the health of that person's self-agency?
I think for me, a lot of them got in the way of that, of self-agency, but I don't, I'm always loath to make a broad brush statement about much of anything. I mean, I think that's part of my training as a journalist. And I guess where I think that for some people, there's a need for that kind of clear delineation of black and white, right and wrong, good and bad, in and out. And I think for some people, that's a very stabilizing force. I've known people for whom that was the case, who came to it on their own out of difficult life experiences, and I think needed somebody to tell them where the boundaries were. I think for me, growing up with it, having sort of skipping that whole process of discovery and decision-making, it felt different, and I think, in some ways I think about it, I'm just going to dive right in here, when it comes to sexual submission, right? That can be for some people empowering, erotic, exciting, if it's chosen, if it's consensual. But I think, to sort of skip all the prelude to that and jump right into the, you must unquestioningly submit, not necessarily to God, but to an idea of God. For me, that short circuits an entire process that is really critical for spiritual, emotional, character development, and for it being, a genuine spiritual expression. So I think that people can arrive in a place where they want and choose and submit to, a version of the divine that for them is very productive, constructive. But it has to be something that people arrive at themselves. And I think it's going to look a lot of different ways for different people.
Yeah, and your illustration is interesting. So I'll go there. I think, and what do I know? But I think those who have a sexual submission as far as a kink would tell you they're very much in charge of their agency. There's an understanding in that agency. But you wrote an instant best-selling book called the EXvangelicals, meaning you have a story. It's a memoir, but the book is resonating with so many people because they have stories similar to yours, or I'll add me, similar to mine, where religious belief, different than the illustration we just talked about, the religious beliefs seem to rob us of our agency. And so I appreciate your temperament as a journalist and just a kind person to not overstate. But would you say that's a lot of people who are experiencing that they're waking up to certain doctrines, certain faith beliefs that left them with, my gosh, who am I?
Sure. And I think that that was my experience, and that was also the experience of many, many people I talked to for the book and have heard from since I wrote the book. Because as you say, I think it is a common experience. I guess what I'm trying to avoid is the idea that somehow some notion of, submission to, union with, obedience to God is necessarily oppressive. I don't think that it is, but I think too often those ideas become weaponized and they turn into instruments for control. And, whether intentionally or not, that is the effect in many churches where, a particular kind of person is in charge, and anyone who doesn't fit into that, sort of usually very patriarchal notion of how the family, the church, the society is supposed to be, obviously very heteronormative notion in most evangelical churches, is on the margins. And many times, racialized people feel on the margins. And so, I want to be careful to talk. I mean, I'm not a person who's anti-religion at all. And I think that sometimes part of religion is a certain kind of rigor, a certain kind of discipline, a certain kind of commitment to ideals and structures and beliefs and practices and rituals. And I think that can be very healthy. But again, it's when those ideas kind of, it's very hard, in human hands for those things not to turn into weapons that are wielded against people.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, I really appreciate also the good that you're trying to say. Sarah, I'm still a Christian minister. I'm no longer an evangelical minister, but a religious faith. And for me, through the construct or language of Christian spirituality is still important to me. So though I left evangelicalism, I certainly didn't leave not just religious faith. The language of Christian spirituality is still an important and meaningful thing. So yes, and we could even look at the data. Obviously, those who hold on to, there are tremendous human flourishing benefits when people have a religious faith. But we are talking about evangelicalism, exvangelicalism, and, and by the way, I hope people read the whole book because it gets quite human. I mean, it's human through the whole way with your memoir, but it gets extremely human at the end. And when you're talking about family members, your brother, you're talking about friends you know. You're talking a dear story about your grandfather. But you have a story, or you have a chapter that even talks about religious trauma. So, talking about these things in a general way, are some of these more rigid theological perspectives of American evangelicalism, would you say they caused you've seen them cause religious trauma? Do you consider yourself someone who experienced some trauma due to a religious faith? Or evangelicalism, your brand of it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is because I was seeing kind of out in public, because of social media, I was seeing a variety of really interesting conversations happening, on Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, everywhere really in the last several years about what it means to be evangelical, what it means to grow up in, what is really kind of a specific insular culture, and also one that's obviously been very influential in our politics and the larger culture, and just a very big subculture that encompasses a lot of people. So there's sort of a shared language, a shared worldview, as much as there is diversity of opinion and practice within evangelicalism, and it's hard to define what evangelicalism is, I think there is sort of a shared experience of being in that world. And then for many people who have left it, there's a shared experience. And one of the things that people were talking about in these spaces that really didn't exist until fairly recently is this idea of religious trauma. And there have been a couple of books written about it. There are a growing number of, clinicians, therapists, mental health practitioners who are beginning to talk about it, research religious trauma, sort of understand it. And, one of the challenges is that, and I talk about this in the book, is that, there is a lot of research that suggests that being part of a religious community is really positive for many people, that, there are correlations in some research between mental health well-being and being part of a religious community. And so I think for people who do experience traumatic events or traumatic theology even, it can be harder to kind of tease out what's doing the work there. And, I didn't have a language for it, but I talk about my brother in that chapter and myself, just some of the, really almost kind of textbook trauma responses that we had to some of the things we were taught, this very vivid, literal hellfire and brimstone, view of the afterlife. I talk a lot in the book about, my relatives who I believed were going to hell, and the fear that I felt, and the, really visceral, vivid kind of fear about that. And that's just one example. I mean, I talk to people who grew up with a terror of the rapture, being told this really kind of novel, relatively new theological idea of the last 150 years at most, I think.
That's right. Yeah,
that we're all going to be sort of taken up into the clouds, and the sort of left behind, or if you're a little bit older, thief in the night vision of the rapture and the apocalypse. I interviewed one woman who talked about coming home and finding that her mother, kind of as a joke or a test, had staged this fake rapture, and she, left her clothes sitting out, and this girl just lost it, believing that she'd been left behind. And, her mother came out later and, said, no, it was just a joke. But she said, why were you afraid? If you're, there must be something wrong with your faith if you, thought you weren't taken.
Yeah.
So, if you didn't know it was a joke. So, those kinds of things that are, they're not the classic types of trauma that you think about. It's not a car accident or abuse, although certainly abuse can and does occur within a religious context and under sort of religious auspices for some people. But these are things that are more sort of, the day-to-day, how you're growing up, how you're being told to see the world, see yourself, your body, your nature, and then how to see other people. And for a lot of people that I know, for myself and for people I interviewed, and also this is backed up by some of the researchers that are doing this kind of work, the response to that, especially for people who as children are raised with those ideas and have no real outlet for it, no way to cope with it, no alternative perspective, those, manifest in ways that look and feel a lot like trauma.
Yeah.
And I think, when you overlay the sort of theological, spiritual, religious piece on top of something that's just already scary, I think that can mess with people's minds, and their hearts and their spirits. Like something that's supposed to be a source of comfort is a source of real terror. And that complicates, how you see yourself, your emotional development, and also how you see God.
Yeah, that's right. No, you're spot on. And I think, mental health experts are going to say that, right, trauma is personal to people. One person can process one thing and it doesn't affect them. You take that exact same thing, and then given that person, their personality, their own experiences, the way they got wired up,
right,
it ends up being a traumatic thing. And what's interesting, Sarah, I want to ask you this, because what you're describing and the evangelical faith I was part of, I was a convert, at 19 years old, and then, my gosh, I became a clergyman in it, I wore the team colors. But it certainly existed before me, before you came along. But right now, it seems to be declining, sort of meteoric. It's never going to all go away. But why? So though you and I are describing something that has certainly been part of the American culture once the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower, why is it going through this amazing shift, this upheaval? Why is it happening now?
Well, the decline in evangelicalism, I think it's important to understand, is part of a much bigger decline in religiosity and or church attendance in America across the board. It's really not unique to evangelicalism, but I talk about it and I argue that it's kind of uniquely significant because of a couple of things. Again, just how large the evangelical movement is and has been, and how uniquely influential it is. I mean, it's hard to think of another group that is so lockstep politically aligned with a particular political project, and that has such numbers as evangelicalism has traditionally had. So not to mention the fact that, again, there's that sort of very large and influential subculture that so many people come from. So, I argue, and this is something I've talked to others about, like, I think there's more of a category for somebody who's sort of a, holidays only, cafeteria Catholic. But there's less of a category for that for evangelicals. There's such an emphasis on belief and, a relationship with God that in going to church, not to say that everybody goes to church consistently, but there's less of a category for like, oh, I'm just kind of a half-hearted evangelical, Whereas, I think in mainline Protestantism as well, there's more of an understanding that some people just go on holidays and it's part of their cultural identity, but maybe it's not their day-to-day life. Evangelicalism looks at that very differently. And so when you leave it, it can feel like a much more extreme departure. What's producing this decline is a bunch of things. I mean, evangelicalism specifically, I think Christianity in general, it is trending older and whiter while the country's trending younger and more diverse. So some of it's just demographic shifts. Pew and the Public Religion Research Institute and others have consistently been finding for quite a number of years now that church attendance is declining. That was especially precipitous during the pandemic. And religious affiliation is declining. The fastest growth is among people who affiliate with no religion at all. And, if you dig into some of like PRRI's data, it looks like some of the reasons people leave are they feel like religious communities, especially for evangelicals in particular, are harmful to their mental health. They're seen as unfriendly to LGBTQ people. So there are a lot of things happening at once that I think are making the country as a whole just less religious. And it's also a more diverse place. So there's sort of less room for these very sort of rigid, insular approaches to religion. And I think that's a lot of what's sparking it. What really sparked the EXvangelical movement / hashtag, as far as I can tell, is in many ways the rise of the politics of Donald Trump around 2015-16. when Blake Chastain, the podcaster and writer, kind of coined that term. And I think it's an effective one because it just kind of suggests you were part of something that you've left for whatever reason. And so the book really explores kind of what those reasons are for a lot of people through, as you mentioned, my own story.
Yeah, no, and I think you detail that well, and you articulate it now very well. It's something I do think about. Evangelicalism won the 20th century. It's an interesting thing when you go back and you cite it. You got the Scopes monkey trial, where they're suing, the state of Tennessee is suing a teacher over his teachings about the theory of evolution. We at least look back at that trial in light of this, that Clarence Darrow, trying to defend anything from a common sense belief to just the right to be able to teach, it kind of won the intellectual day, but the teachings of evangelicalism won the century. Mm-hmm. And then evangelicalism just soared from the 40s, the 50s, 60s, the Jesus movement at the end of the 60s. And then by the time it got to me in the 80s, and then you in the 90s, and then growing up. Here's a long opening to this. This is what I wonder, Sarah, that as, at least in American human development, I wonder if as we have become more aware, as the century went on, and just our awareness psychologically, socially, intellectually, culturally, politically, as we kind of woke up, and these are big, broad general terms, but as we kind of woke up as a people, we were still holding this thing that we go, oh my gosh, the very things they said would make me flourish, as I've grown more aware, these aren't the things that are flourishing me. So do you think it's partly because we've woken up, whatever that means, but become more self-aware?
I mean, I'm not a historian or a sociologist or a psychologist, but I read some, and I think the last 100 years or so that you described, since the time of the Scopes monkey trial and so forth, has obviously been a time of tremendous change, right? I mean, tremendous technological change. And, one of the things that I think has made it possible for people who grew up like I did, and spent time in spaces like you did, to sort of maybe come to have a different kind of process of rethinking faith, deconstructing, to use the term of art, is technology. I mean, I remember as a kid in the 80s and 90s hearing about people who left churches, and it was like this sort of whispered thing. It was like the backsliders, the sinners, people who walked away were sort of seen as like having something wrong with them. And I'm not sure that there were a lot of places to go. I mean, you could define yourself as an atheist. You could go try a different church, but there wasn't a hashtag or, a Facebook group or a podcast or all the things that exist today where you can go sort of talk to other people who are having the same thoughts and experiences. And so, that would have been a very isolating experience. And, I think when I was growing up, I thought the options were pretty much, Christian or atheist. And I guess I had a vague notion that there are some other religions out there. And I didn't have a very clear notion of what mainline Protestantism was or liberal Christianity. I didn't know about biblical criticism, any of that. It was just sort of this very black and white, either or type of view. And, of course, some of that you can find out by doing research, and there have been books written. But I mean, the internet has just exploded the possibilities for what you can find out about, anything from science to human sexuality, to history of religion, and then the people you can find to talk about it with that may live in another state or another country. And I think all of that has, we we can intake information and uptake of information is so much faster and more efficient today. Obviously, that comes with problems and risks and bad information too. But it is much easier to find things out than it ever was before, and to find at least a virtual community around those ideas and experiences.
That's right. Yeah. You can find out about it, and then you can find out the like-minded people who are also wanting to find out about it. And isn't it so parallel? Obviously, anybody that understands church history, the Protestant Reformation is associated with the beginning of Luther in 1517. But some of those ideas were being talked about 100 years before he even talked about it. He just talked about it in parallel with the invention of the printing press, which also helped it. So, when you think about it, there were people talking about some of these things at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. Paul Tillich at Harvard was talking about these things in the 40s and 50s at Harvard Divinity. You might be too young, but did your parents ever tell you, or did you know about the Jesus Seminar that happened in the 80s, which again, evangelicals, those are the enemies, but yes.
And historical Jesus, search for the historical Jesus. And
and things that people go, wait, maybe they weren't so crazy. And then with the, Brian McLaren and Rob Bell starting as evangelical darlings, these were two people that became famous within evangelicalism, and then they go, things
sort of the emergent church era.
They start shifting, and then what's the internet? 97, 98, and then it just so Sarah, what is if we're not sure what an evangelical is, what's an exvangelical?
Somebody who used to be an evangelical and isn't anymore.
Right.
Doesn't find that label suits them. And that can mean a lot of different things to different people. I mean, I first heard that word, which again, Blake Chastain coined, I think, on X. But I first heard it when I was doing a story about how evangelical women were reacting to the Access Hollywood Trump video. And we were talking to a variety of evangelical women, some prominent, and Nicole Nordeman, who actually is a Christian music artist, or has been, and I think is still doing. I think she's still working at kind of loosely in that industry. She was one of the people who'd kind of spoken out. So we talked to her, and she just made this kind of aside in the interview about the idea that some people who used to identify themselves as evangelicals really feel uncomfortable with what that means now, and they're using this word exvangelical. And I my ears kind of perked up because, I mean, we were talking about Trump, but many years before Trump was ever on the scene, I had my own sort of unraveling of my evangelicalism, and had really struggled with a variety of things that I talk about in the book. And so that word kind of resonated with me, and I started just paying attention to it online and seeking it out online, and realized that there was kind of this loosely formed online community around these ideas and around the word deconstruction that we're talking about, not just politics, but sexuality, gender, science, religious pluralism, all kinds of things. And not to mention how all of those questions and dynamics, what they meant for relationships with friends and family within the evangelical bubble, if you were sort of starting to leave it or question it. And I just got really curious about that and kind of fascinated by it. And, that was what led to write the book and do a bunch of interviews with other people who had sort of been on similar journeys at different times and for different reasons.
Yeah, and like you, I as soon as I heard the term, I loved it.
Yeah.
I go, there's just a big yes.
Some people don't. Some people think it sounds negative, or it's about looking backward, and some people, I guess, who would still be an ex-evangelical prefer post-evangelical or progressive Christian, or maybe just atheist or agnostic, and I talk about that too. But I thought, as a hashtag, as a catch-all, it was a useful concept.
Well, I can appreciate that. And I'm in the more progressive space now, and I'm in the more, faith-shifting space. And, those terms are just beginning. No, we have these labels, but the whether it's called progressive Christianity, faith shift, those terms, we're not at a final term yet. We're all in the tumult of it. But I do think what EXvangelical does, I think here's why I like it. I'll say for me, there's a psychological health for me in that term. You partly know where you're going. You have to know where you came from. And if that thing, whatever that thing, marked you in a way, I think these terms help. But, you memoir your own story, and I'll get to the Trump. I'll ask some questions in a moment about the Trump era's effect on this whole evangelicalism, exvangelicalism in a moment. But Sarah, this began for you before Trump ever showed up on the scene. It began for me way before Trump showed up on the scene. It began for Rachel Held Evans way before, or Rob Bell or Bryant, way before.
Right.
So do you know around when that began for you? Those are hard to pinpoint because a lot of it is a fall of certain things. But do you go, like I go 2009 and 10, I was fully raging when that. Do you have a pinpoint in your own life?
I mean, I think I stopped going to evangelical churches regularly soon after college. Even during college, I was exploring other traditions. I visited an Orthodox church. I visited a Catholic church, a couple Catholic churches, and also like kind of a hippie Catholic church where it was like an unsanctioned one where there were like women priests.
Yeah, they're kind of off the grid, right?
Off the grid, yeah. One of my professors took me there, and I guess what he told me is that they said, well, they haven't kicked us out yet. This was, 25 years ago, so I don't know if they still exist. Probably not. Yeah. But I was, I went to a UU church, and I was trying different things. Episcopalian is kind of where I landed a couple years after college. I just felt like I wanted to be in a place that was a little bit more. It seemed like within evangelicalism, there were so many competing theologies. There were the Calvinists versus the Arminians. And, I grown up kind of charismatic evangelical, and I went to a Christian school that was like, that's not a thing. And so I already recognized that there was a diversity of opinion to a degree. And I just wanted like more space than that even. I wanted to be in a space where that was inclusive of LGBTQ people. I talk a lot about in the book about my grandpa who came out as gay late in life and how that sort of shaped the way I looked at that. And I think also I was struggling with that whole intense relationship with Jesus belief thing. Like sometimes I would feel God or feel something in church, and I really wanted to connect to God. I really wanted to, I thought a lot about bigger questions about sort of where we're going, where we came from, why we're here. But I really struggled with the charismatic piece of my faith because it felt so sort of like intense and personal and miraculous. And that stuff didn't really happen for me. I tried to speak in tongues and I was never really sure that it was happening. And so when I was exposed in college during a study abroad to the Anglican liturgy in England, and I'd also, been visiting, older traditions like Roman Catholic and Orthodox, I found a liturgical expression of faith to be somehow really comforting and kind of exciting because it felt like it gave me something I could do with my body and with my words to participate, to practice a faith, as opposed to having to think and feel and believe, which was really hard for me as much as I tried. And so for all of those reasons, I kind of landed in the Episcopal Church for a while, and I still go to Episcopal churches sometimes. But
can I ask you when you were going through when you were going through the process you just articulated, and now I'm going to ask, all my therapy's going to, I'm not a therapist, all my years in a therapy is going to come out. Because Sarah, I had to do a decent amount of therapy to undo a lot of this. But when you were going through this, was it fun, exciting, just curious, or were some of your neuro pathways, your somatic repetitions, were you experiencing like, oh no, I'm cheating on God. Oh no, what if my parents found out? Oh no, maybe I'm real, maybe what I used to believe really is right, but this is all wrong. And like, were you experiencing the angst of that?
Oh, yes, completely. And still do sometimes.
Right.
Because what you're taught as a kid is so hardwired. And, I think the sad thing for me is that I think there are people in my life who believe that I have rebelled or rejected God or rejected their idea of God. And if you could see the years I have struggled with God and tried to connect to God, and if I didn't care about any of this, I would have just walked out the door of my evangelical church and never looked back. But I care a lot. And, there are people that walk away and I think never think much about it. Maybe there are, I don't know. And I am certainly not here to judge anyone who lands in atheism or agnosticism. I think I understand why people go there, but that's not how the world feels to me. And it's not what I want to be true about the world. And moreover, I've had enough moments in, European cathedrals and in synagogue and in the mountains where I felt something like spiritual ecstasy that I think I have reason to feel like there is something bigger to connect to.
Yeah.
And so all of that, all of that searching was about trying to find a way to sort of put all that together, like this desire, this yearning for something spiritual and bigger. But also, I felt like I was being told to believe things that I didn't see a lot of good reason to believe. I mean, the biggest example, or I think one of the best examples, is just this, you mentioned the Scopes Monkey trial. It became really clear to me that the young earth creationism of my Christian school and my family was just not rooted in anything like the scientific consensus. I became, aware that there were many religious people who believe in God and also accept evolutionary science, and that it was like the overwhelming consensus of scientists all over the world of a variety of different faiths. And it started to feel really manipulative and wrong that I had been told I had to believe this thing that, like, clearly nobody except those of us with the preconceived reasons for believing it seemed to believe. And so, that was one thing. And then again, like my relationship with my grandfather, I was being asked to sort of tell him that everything he had felt about himself from childhood and had to push back and tried so hard not to be was wrong. And that didn't feel right to me either. So, for me, it's all been about how do I square my intellect, my heart, my compassion with my spiritual sensibility, and what are the things I believe or thought I believed? Why do I believe? Do I believe them because they really resonate with what seems authentic and right and meaningful and true to me, or do I believe them because someone told me I had to? And if somebody told me I had to, well, those are the things I need to interrogate, particularly if holding on to those ideas is going to put me in a position where I am cut off from, I'm disfellowshipped from certain people that I would otherwise love and connect to. And so that's been kind of like the essence of my spiritual journey. And it still is, to a large degree, what it is.
Yeah. And, let me just ask you some questions about the head part and then the heart part. For me, Sarah, intellectually, I was having a tough time. And I can't remember if I saw you say this in one of your interviews or you recall it in the book. You tell the story about the young nursing student who had basically learned her Grey's Anatomy through the being taught the literal story of Adam and Eve, and expecting there to be one more rib. And then she starts to experience my term. This is my term. As she discovers what's real, she starts to experience intellectual shame.
Yeah.
So in all the people you talk about, because one of the wonderful things about your book is it is a deeply personal memoir, but you also make it the memoir and stories of other people. And you do talk about that. When you were talking to people, again, back to the head part, is part of this shift are people experiencing an intellectual shame when they kind of wake up to some things? Is that a real thing?
Yeah, I think that's a theme that I've heard from more than one person. And yes, that story is in the book. And I, like an ex-evangelical sort of influencer I follow was actually just talking about this the other day, about this, this when you sort of wake up and feel this kind of anger, maybe in addition to shame at the things that you've missed, at the gaps in your education, and maybe gaps in your compassion, because of what you haven't learned. And I felt that. I think part of the reason I like the word ex-evangelical is because of the number of times before I ever heard it that I had to explain myself to people by saying, well, I was raised evangelical. It's pretty sheltered. I didn't do that. I didn't watch that movie. I never heard about that. That wasn't my experience. The sort of standard conventional American experiences of growing up. Some of them I didn't have, or I had them differently. Like there wasn't prom or homecoming at Christian school. There was homecoming, but there was no dancing. It was just, you wear a formal dress, not too showy, and you sit in a dimly lit room with some string lights and eat a big meal. And as one of my good friends, I think at senior homecoming or senior would be prom, said, as she put potato salad on her plate, "This is the Christian version of drinking." We just did things differently, and I sometimes have to explain sort of gaps in my backstory, and that's fine. I'm not like traumatized by that, actually. I think we live in this beautiful, big, diverse country with a huge range of experiences, and people come into, there isn't one universal American experience. I think that's kind of a myth, but there have been enough times that I've had to sort of explain myself by being like, this was my background, so I don't know what you're talking about, or I did not have that experience that you're assuming that I would have had.
Yeah, and in your book, you certainly talk about your parents a bit, and I know you want to also honor them. They're not people who are here, so I don't want to talk about people who can't represent themselves, but what I partly did was I identified with them in the sense, and I made some assumptions about them that I could be wrong. And that is, they're like me. They were a convert. They were not raised in evangelicalism. And then they were converted to it either late teens or 20s. And then they believed it. Now I won't use them. I'll use me. To be fair to them. I want to be fair to them. Yeah. I believed it so much that then it's, of course, oh my gosh, I don't want to be raised how I was. I have to now give this to the world, and certainly give it to the family and children that are coming. Thankfully, my children experienced 2 lives. I was able to get out of it. And plus, I was never one of those, and I say this in quotes, not trying to sound weird at all. Sarah, I ended up in that, super cool Christianity.
Congratulations.
Yeah, right. I didn't go, I was like Campus Crusade, and then ended up on the staff at Willow Creek, so I was in this super, and I put super cool in quotes. Sure. And here's what's interesting. I was when I joined the staff of Willow, which is very much an evangelical church.
With kind of a hip, contemporary, accessible gloss.
Yeah, right. It was
Yep.
the whole seeker, it
Right.
basically mothered the seeker movement, which obviously had its own evangelical critics. And by the way, I went to seminary where you did your undergrad. And
Trinity.
Trinity, when I would go over there as a Willow staff member working on his master's, I would have to hear all the very hyper-religious students rip apart Willow Creek. So I just kind of kept my mouth shut, knowing, they don't like me here. But here's my point. I remember sharing, I was with my wife at Willow, and some of the staff go, "Hey, so how'd you two meet?" And we tell our Christian dating through Campus Crusade. And this is even that evangelical Willow. Their faces are stone, and one of the girls is gutsy enough to go, "I think you dated in a cult." So, yes, we had to do a lot of recovery on the whole purity movement, the moral absolutes.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're limited in time, and I want to move this to some heart things. Sarah, you tell a powerful story about your grandfather who lived to, 97?
Yeah.
Wow. And was fully, as his body was breaking down, though, his mind for most of those 90-some-odd years was...
Yep.
Yeah.
I'd say until the last year. He
Yeah.
was, he was a little more forgetful, definitely just slower moving, but he did not have any, serious dementia or anything like that. He was still with us very much, which was pretty wonderful.
Yeah, and you're a great storyteller. So we first learned about your grandfather first in the sense that you grew up in a home where you knew your parents had created some kind of distance between you, the grandchild, and your grandfather.
Uh-huh.
We later learn truth about his life, and that he's a man who's gay and has known he was gay. He was married to your grandmother several decades, but he resolves to the fact, and seemingly happily, that he's gay. And you talk about this, and I want to, this part, just that part of the story was amazing to me. Sarah, the church I'm the minister now, 30% of our church is LGBTQIA. I think we were the first post-evangelical church in the country that first hired the first openly gay song leader in Nicole Serrano. So not only do my straight people have exvangelical stories, you can imagine my gay crowd, LGBT crowd, have ones that I think both you and I could list. Oh, now that's trauma. That's trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to say, I just love that part of the book, and I never met your grandfather, but I loved him through the pages of your book. One of the things you talk about with him, one of the things you talk about was his unique ability, and then we learn, of course, to accept you. Mm-hmm. Because you fall in love, you get married to the Christian evangelical guy, and then your marriage doesn't work out, and you're very honest about that, and talk about the love and acceptance you've received from your grandfather, and even share a personal note that you had written to your parents about them telling you. But I want to read something from your book, and it's at the end of one of the chapters. And I think by now you have children. You have 2 boys, is that it?
Right. Yeah.
And you talk about, I think, meeting at a coffee shop. You talk about meeting your ex. As divorced people need to do. They still need to navigate parenting and work things through. And you're talking, and you, can I just read, but let me read this.
Of course.
you're meeting with him, and then you talk about how the conversation then turns to parenting and your boys, and it goes like this. The conversation turned to the boys, and eventually the end of our marriage. We both felt that it had been fundamentally over for a long time. But I was the one to pull the plug first. And on that day, I told him again, I was sorry for the pain I knew it caused him. I told him I was still in pain, sometimes from the weight of all of it. We followed all the rules, I said, tearing up in frustration. They told us to follow the rules so we wouldn't get hurt. We're not hurting because we broke the rules, he said. We're hurting because we followed the rules. Yeah, I think that story says a lot for us. Do you remember that day?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the tragedy of it, is that, the rules, they were created for a reason. We humans need them. We need structure. We need guidance. But they're in service of something bigger. And the rules that we were given in purity culture, I think, were, as I look at it, designed to try to circumvent human pain, put this powerful thing, sexuality, romance, into a controlled channel. And I think the reality is that there's just no way to do it that isn't sometimes a little messy when you talk about the human heart. And for us, I think the fear that we had around getting that wrong wound up being very destructive.
Yeah. Sarah, when I went through my deconstruction, I was the pastor of a big church, a big mega church. And, when most people go through a deconstruction, they can just walk out the back of the church or just go, I guess I'm not going to go anymore. But when you're the teacher, when you're the lead minister, it is a whole other thing. And so I really needed a therapist to help me process it. And why this story you tell in the book.
It's okay, by the way, to need a therapist if you're just walking out the back pew too.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Yes.
But yes, I can see why when you're in a high profile position, making this very personal, intimate, difficult decision about your soul and your spirit and your relationship with God and with other people, that requires another level of...
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And good shout out for the therapist, because I fully agree. My wife's a therapist, so they help us through a lot. But I remember my therapist saying to me, this is my version of the story. As I'm kind of laying in a crumple in his office, he goes, David, you did all the right things. You followed all the right ways. You actually mastered it, trusting that all the right things would happen in your life. And they didn't. They didn't. And when his words said that, wow. And I can imagine, Sarah, there's a lot of people reading your book, that not only the humanness, the tenderness of this story of two people trying to work out part of their lives, a young granddaughter trying to figure out a way to live what she knows is true in her heart, which is, I love my grandfather, and I love him just the way he is. It was hard, wasn't it? It's hard when we were part of a type of faith that did not love the people we loved. That's hard, isn't it?
It thought that it was. It thought that that was love.
Yeah, right.
But it didn't feel like love to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's right. Well, you also work for NPR. You not only wrote this best-selling book, instant best-selling book, by the way, New York Times. Congratulations. You're also a reporter for NPR, and you have been on the political beat very much. I think in 2016 you were assigned the Trump campaign. Were you also specifically on the Trump campaign in 2020?
No. So in 2016, I was initially just hired to cover the Republican primary. So I spent a lot of time with most of the candidates you may or may not remember this fight.
So when it was that big field of, what was it, 17?
Something like that.
Yeah.
I followed Dr. Ben Carson around.
Oh, man.
Cheese pizza at the Iowa State Fair. I was in New Hampshire with Carly Fiorina for a while. I was on a bus with Ted Cruz in Iowa.
Oh, my gosh.
Stuff like that. So it was an interesting ride. But, everybody was saying, well, eventually, I know Trump's at the top of the polls, but that's going to change. It did. Yeah, and so it became Trump. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can imagine even when it was the Ted Cruz days, the Republican God card is already beginning to be pulled then.
Oh, for sure.
But, Sarah, what specifically, by the way, last week CNN was at our church, so CNN was filming all Sunday morning at our church in Nashville, and then CNN interviewed me, and they're trying to cover this whole shift that's happening. Of course, the questions came to Trump, and I think this shift, this ex-evangelical shift, and now this progressive Christian shift, because obviously ex-evangelicals are becoming atheist nuns, and I agree with you. I totally understand that. I totally get it. And in fact, back to self-agency and health, if that makes somebody healthier, where my Christian spirituality is at, listen, if it makes you healthier that way, goodness, go that way. I don't have a Christian spirituality that needs to win or persuade.
Right.
But obviously, there's a number of us who are sticking with it. We're not evangelicals, but we're trying to reimagine a different kind of Christian spirituality. So they were asking about that, but also the Trump thing. So with your reporter hat on, but then, of course, with your personal experience, what unique thing has the Trump presidency and the massive evangelical support that was huge in 16 increased, if I'm right? It actually increased in 2020, I think. I think
it depends on which exit polls, but it kind of held steady.
Yeah, I think I saw 70%, that you know more than me on this, but 70% of them evangelicals voted for him in 16. 80% of them voted for him.
Again, it depends which exit polls you cite. I always say it was about 8 and 10. And the other problem is one question. This is a tiny little data point, but so people who say at the exit polls, I am an evangelical, about 80% of them vote for Trump. But people who there are, what about those who don't use that word anymore because they associate it with Trump, right? So It's sort of like it's becoming, there are people who argue that it's become sort of like a political sociological term rather than a theological term. That's a longer conversation. But yeah, it's about 8 and 10 people. I think some people said the numbers declined. Some people said they had held steady. There doesn't seem to be a major shift of any kind.
Well, or
people who identify as evangelical.
Yeah, and by the way, I love the fine data points, but per your book, but even what you witnessed. You see, when they voted for Trump, when that massive crowd voted for him in 16, we just were voting. I didn't vote for him, but the vote was for this TV star who was going to be different. By the time we get to 2020, oh no, the American public already has Trump they've already been able to witness for his 4-year administration.
There's a track record there, yes.
Yeah, so whether it was the same amount or a little more, the idea is most people who consider themselves American evangelicals voted for him.
Yes.
And then in your book, you bring up the Clinton years, the Lewinsky years, and all the evangelical comments about that, and then the dissonance. So all of this said, here's my question. What specifically did the evangelical support overwhelmingly for Donald Trump have on the whole ex-evangelical movement?
I think that alliance between evangelicalism and Trumpism has prompted not necessarily a massive departure, but it's a big enough group. Evangelicalism is a big enough group that it's a lot of people, and so even a small percentage of people shifting one way or another makes a difference. And for a lot of people, I think it has triggered soul searching, the kinds of conversations that I was describing on social media. I think it's been a catalyst for thinking about, and in some cases publicly thinking about, some of these issues that, as we've discussed, have been percolating for a long time. But it sort of raised questions about, what does it mean to be evangelical? And what does this political alliance that has grown more and more robust in recent decades, what does that mean? What does that say about evangelicalism? Is it really in any way relevant to Christianity? And I am not somebody who sits here and makes pronouncements about what Christianity is or isn't, and what Jesus, would do or not do when it comes to politics. I think those kinds of conversations are kind of anachronistic. But I think for people who value their faith, or for people who are struggling with their faith, this moment in which evangelical support for Trump has been such a big part of the conversation and such a big part of the political reality, I think it's prompted many of them to think hard about what that means for the movement and for themselves.
Yeah. And as I often say, I don't know if I've figured out the right way to word it, but the tremendous evangelical support for Donald Trump, our progressive church began in 2018. And so the evangelical support for Trump it ironically and oddly helped fuel the growth of our church.
People who were looking for something else.
Yeah, because obviously ex-evangelicals are that. What are they? They are the sons and daughters of this faith. You don't convert to ex-evangelicalism. You are leaving something. And so, as I've said, by the way, I'm a minister. I'm not a journalist. I think we're moving. I think Christian spirituality is moving to a third millennium theology. It goes into its third millennium. Christianity always evolves. That's not what's wrong with Christianity. That's everything right with it. And I think it is in a major, major shift that social issues are part of it, like abortion, like guns, like LGBTQ. How could it not be? So I don't want to be dismissive of that, of course. But it's also beyond that. And a whole reframing of theology, a whole reframing of what salvation is, what is atonement. Anyway, that's for another conversation. But
it's an interesting one. But yeah, and as you've mentioned, it's not the first time Christianity has gone through a big shift. It's always going through shifts, but there have been some pretty... There seems to be, and I'm not the first person to note this, I can't remember who said it first, but there's a big shift about every 500 years, and we might be right for one. That is not an original thought, though. No, and I'll give the resource for it. No, you're spot on. It's Phyllis Tickle wrote a book called The Great Emergence, and you're right. And the second podcast in which I've said, somebody said that. Who was it? And the person said Phyllis Tickle. And
Phyllis Tickle.
Down.
Yeah.
I'll remember next time.
Yeah, don't forget Tickle. It shouldn't be hard to forget.
Like Elvis.
So I know we're coming to the end of the time, but so we know one thing about Sarah McCammon, and that is you are an evangelical, but existentially, spiritually, human where do you find yourself these days?
You mean spiritually?
Yeah, sure.
What label do I use for myself now?
It's okay if you don't, but I'm just curious to know.
No, I'm deeply influenced and inspired by Christian spirituality. That's the language I have for faith. I talk in the book about being in an interfaith marriage now. My husband's a Reformed Jew. And, I really felt a desire, kind of surprising desire, the last few years to become more involved in a faith community. And so I've spent the last few years going to synagogue with him pretty consistently. I feel like, given the history of our respective faiths, the more respectful thing for me to do was to go with him to synagogue than to make him come to church with me. Just if you know anything about the history and the chronology there. And I've really benefited from it. It's been very meaningful for me. I've even gone to some Intro to Judaism classes where I've learned more about concepts that exist in Judaism that Christianity is also drawn from. And it's given new dimension to my understanding of faith. And it's really nice to have something that I can share. It's kind of more, that feels like more common ground for us than going to church, although he does go to church with me occasionally on, big holidays and so forth. So, in fact, we've gone to church with my former spouse and our kids, and we've done Passover with his former spouse, and even once my former spouse, we invited them. So, it's a kind of an eclectic expression these days, but it's authentic to the people that I love and the people in my life. And I feel closer to God when I sort of open myself to all of it. So that's what I'm doing.
And man, that's a what a beautiful circle of people that has come around. And Sarah, I'm a Christian minister, but I'm in synagogue pretty consistently, a Reform synagogue as well. My best friend here, one of my best friends, is a Jewish rabbi, and I spent a lot of time in his synagogue and at our church. His wife's co-rabbis the synagogue. In my Christian church, they are guest speakers consistently, and I have when I'm with Flip and he tells me about his Reformed Judaism. And he's not trying to convert me to be a Jew.
They don't want you to convert.
Oh no,
they will let you, but it's not a thing. And I actually like that was one of the things I struggled with in evangelicalism. So I like the no pressure vibe of being in synagogue. Nobody's trying to convert me at all.
Yeah, right. No, in fact, what he'll say is that they'll try to talk you out of it. But but when I'm with him and he's telling me about his Judaism, his spirituality of his Judaism, it takes me deeper into my Christian spirituality. And he tells me the same thing. He goes, David, when you tell me about your Christian spirituality, which is not evangelical at all, he goes, it takes me deeper into my Judaism. Sarah, isn't it exhausting when you have to win and convert the whole world? Isn't that exhausting? And isn't it freeing when you no longer have to?
Yeah. And you open yourself to being able to learn from somebody else, from their experience, from their existence.
That's right.
That is really beautiful for me, No, that's really cool. I'm glad that you've had that relationship. Yes.
Well, do you think you'll, I'm sure you'll write more and write more books. Do you think you'll write on the topic or the related topic again?
I want to write something else, I think, in the spirituality and faith department. Probably nothing about politics anytime soon, because I think about that more than I want to. And this book it touches on politics, but it's really not primarily about that. I definitely want to write more books. I need to get past this little election thing before I have the bandwidth to do that, though.
I'll just say, don't we all? Don't we all have to get through it? Yeah. But I can only imagine you are dipped and saturated and plunged into it. Have you gotten what has been? I'm sure you've gotten evangelical kickback on this. What's it been like?
A little, but so much less than I expected. I got like one email that was warning me about, the dire eternity that waits for me. And I wrote back to the guy and I asked him if he'd actually read the book, and he hadn't.
Was this just an evangelical dude, or was this a person? Was this a significant influencer leader?
No. It was just random. I mean, right. They're a significant person made in God's image, but not a famous person. And, I got like a kind of a handwritten letter, a very long handwritten letter to the same effect that was sent to my employer. And, I didn't write back but like only a couple, I think there's maybe one other message like that. The vast majority has been overwhelmingly positive. I've heard from some people who still, from some couple pastors who are not necessarily evangelical pastors, but I think evangelical adjacent. I've heard from parents who raised their kids in evangelicalism and they're adults now, and they're kind of reflecting on some of the challenges that created for them in a way that feels really beautiful and full of humility and growth. And lots of people like me who have said, thank you for writing this. It put it into words and made me feel like I wasn't weird or alone. And that's been so gratifying. I mean, that's why I wrote the book, because I knew that my experience wasn't unique. I was seeing all of these conversations happening all around me, and I'd been having them, on the sidelines of parties and things. You meet another person who grew up the same way, and you just have this instant bond. And so I really wanted to write something about that experience, and it's meant a lot to a lot of people, and I'm just so grateful for that.
Yeah, no, it's really a beautiful book. And if anybody hasn't read it, it is beyond interesting. It certainly includes interesting, but I think, Sarah, you tell a story for so many of us. It's healing. It's affirming and confirming. You feel when you read this book, and Sarah, it's kind of partly therapeutic. It really is. Own it.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Several people have told, or a couple of, at least of therapists have told me they're recommending it to their clients. So several actually, I've gotten some private messages. That's helpful too. I mean, I'm so glad that it speaks to people. So
yes, I can only imagine therapists would recommend it. And you quote Sarah Anderson
Dr. Laura Anderson.
Yeah, Dr. Laura Anderson in the book, and she'll be on my podcast in a couple of weeks. Yeah, talking about religious trauma. Well, we can find you on NPR. That's if we can. You'll be running so fast till November. Where can people find you, Sarah?
A Substack that I update, anywhere from once a week to once a month, just like little behind the scenes on the campaign trail, kind of musings, that kind of thing. And it's free. I allow subscribers, but nobody has to subscribe. It's called Off the Air, a journalist's after hours thoughts. And yeah, I mean, if anybody has not read the book, it does help authors when you buy them. So I always appreciate that.
Good.
And you can find me on, Instagram and X as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really, thank you. And thank you for telling us amazing healing stories, very human ones. And as I tell my people, you're never more spiritual than when you are human. And so there's a lot of humanity in this book, so much so. So thank you.
Well, thank you, David. This has been a really thoughtful conversation, and I really appreciated it.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
Take care.